So next up, we're going to be hearing from Audrey Zibelman, who is the chairwoman of the New York State Public Service Commission. In that role, she's responsible for the regulation of the electric, gas, water, and telecommunication industries. So that's just about everything we care about. And so I think within a few years, we'll all be crediting her for everything or blaming her for everything. And Audrey comes to New York State government after a time in the private sector. And before that, she worked in a couple other states for government as well. And she's going to talk to us today about the future of the electric utility industry and where that may be going. Audrey?
Yeah. I think this is my only slide, so okay, that's me. Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I think this is really an important gathering because, quite frankly, what I'm going to talk about is that the future of our success in the electric industry is actually dependent upon you. And it's very, very important that you're having these discussions and that we can start talking about what is the role of customers in really thinking about how we're going to reform the electric sector in New York. So have anyone here has heard of REV? Okay, good. So that's one thing solved. We're wondering how we can get the message out. Basically, what I want to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of context of what happened in the electric industry, why we're doing what we're doing, and the role of consumers going forward. The electric industry in the United States, and really all across Europe, was really built up during the 20th century over a set of principles that basically would look at large-scale generation plants, whether it's coal or nuclear, and then more frequently in the 90s with gas, as thinking about the fact that we can reach economies of scale by building these large power plants, then transmission, then distribution, and meeting demand that way. And it was actually quite true. They were very economically efficient. We had integrated monopolies who owned generation, transmission, and distribution, and effectively had folks like me, regulators, who are overseeing their rates. In the 90s, changes in technology allowed us to start thinking about the generation sector as no longer being a natural monopoly, but that it could be competitive. And why that's important is that when you have regulated monopolies, this is something we saw in New York, they would put power plants into their rate base, like 3 Mile Hour plant, may not be economically sustainable, but because they were monopolies, they got to recover those costs. In the 90s, we started developing what we call wholesale markets with the recognition that we could drive efficiency through the power grid if we put private capital to work. And where it wasn't a natural monopoly and people could compete with each other, we can drive down the cost of power, but also, more importantly, one of the things we recognize is the power grid itself is essentially a single machine. And all these generators and all this transmission and all this demand was interconnected. And if we can operate it like a single machine, in other words, rather than each utility thinking about their power plants individually, we think about how to drive it more efficiently by thinking about how to use the most efficient unit next, or the most economic, we could drive down price and also encourage, through competition, the development of more advanced generation. So we did this in New York. We were actually quite successful. After the markets got started in the early 2000s, 1998, we saw significant retirement of old generation. New York right now only has 4% of its generation is coal. The rest is hydro and nuclear and gas. And we also saw more efficient power plants being created. And more importantly, customers weren't paying for power plants that they really didn't need anymore. So that was then. Now we're sort of fast forward to where we are now in the industry, and this is what REV is all about. During the 50s and 60s, kind of during this mindset we were just talking about, demand for electricity was increasing, basically across the United States, 1%, 2%, 3% a year. Utilities were able to build power plants, transmission, and distribution, and people weren't seeing really price increases because the fact that because you had usage increasing, that you could spread that need across many, many people. We're now at a different era of time in the electric industry. One is the fact is that demand load is not increasing like it used to. In fact, it's either flattening or decreasing. We also have very old infrastructure. All that building that was going on in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s needs to be replaced. So one of the things that we identified in New York was that even though we invested about $17 billion in infrastructure in the last 10 years, we're looking at potentially another $30 billion over the next 10 to 15 years simply to replace old infrastructure. The other thing that's happened is that we've seen changes in technology. Solar costs have gone down. Battery costs have gone down. There's more intelligence in building management systems, as I think all of you know. And we have big data, so we're able to deal with distributed resources much better. The other thing that's happening is consumer requirements are changing. Customers want clean energy. They are worried about the environment, certainly worried about price. And as we know in New York, after the Sandy, after Irene, and after these major climatic events, we're worried about resiliency. And so the question then becomes, what should we be doing at a regulatory level to take a look at these changes? Because the fact of the matter is, one of our concerns is, I'm an economic regulator, but we also have an obligation under state law to consider the natural environment. If we have to replace all that old infrastructure with new infrastructure, and the demand for electricity is not growing but actually flattening and shrinking, then what's happening is prices are going to go up. And in a state like New York, where we very much worry about the price of energy because we know it's a high-tax state, we know there's a lot of challenges, what should we be doing to help manage those costs from going forward? So that became sort of one of the things that Governor Cuomo, after Sandy, saw what happened in the city, saw what happened to the utilities, said we've got to do things differently. We can't stay on the same track. And so what are the things that the big thing about REV is this, to say we have an opportunity now to use distributed energy resources, whether it's CHP, whether it's solar, whether it's battery, whether it's fuel cell, whether it's building management systems to help us manage demand better, to help manage the cost of energy, but also to make the system more resilient and really start thinking about the fact that it's not just a one-way grid. We can use the ability to control demand as an effective way of controlling costs. And the reason for this is quite simple. Because electricity can't be stored, it's different than any other product. We have to produce it every time someone turns on a light, turns on a computer, a generator has to go up, increase its demand. Because we can't really store it, what that means is we have a lot of generators who have to be available just a few hours a year in the summer when the system is peaking. And in order to get that power to consumers, we have to build transmission and distribution. So the big thing about REV is say, well, wait a minute. If we could become more efficient users of electricity, if we could take the advantage of the ability to basically use these distributed resources better, we don't have to have a system which today has essentially a 54% capacity utilization factor. Think about it this way. If you had a building that was only occupied 54% of the year, right? How helpful would that be? If you had a bunch of buildings that you only needed less than 2 weeks a year, would you build that building? Or would you think about something else? Well, that's how the grid works. And so one of the things we're doing with REV is say, well, how do we use demand better? If we have buildings, if people can put in CHP, if people can put in ice storage, if at a residential level we could look at rooftop solar, even battery storage when it comes to electric vehicles, and we aggregate these and we manage them as a group, what happens is now we can start managing demand and do it very effectively and take costs out of the system. And it's not immaterial. One of the things that we looked at is what's it going to cost, what's that last bit that sort of these power plants that we run less than 100 hours a year sometimes, what's that costing us? Sometimes less than a week a year. What's that costing us? It's about $500 million to $1 billion a year that we're paying for things just in case it gets hot. So our whole point about REV is say, well, wait a minute, we've got an opportunity to start using demand better. We can send price signals. We can start shifting demand so that it's not peaking. And what that could do is that could sort of reduce our need essentially to build generation, build transmission, build distribution, which is very expensive, and also, as a matter of fact, start integrating clean energy so it's no longer just the environmental aspect, but the economic aspect of how we're running the power grid. So REV started us thinking about, okay, what changes? Well, one change is we're looking at, and there are a number of them. One is regulatory. So today, our utilities in New York do not own generation. And one of the things that the regulation has done is they basically have said, we have made you economically indifferent to energy efficiency. If Con Ed does a lot around energy efficiency, we have mechanisms in place in their rates where we make them economically neutral. We levelize it out. So that's good. We've taken away a natural disincentive. But what we don't have is an incentive. We don't have a way for Con Ed to make money if they're helping consumers save money. And so one part of REV is say we need to change that regulatory construct. So rather than being economically neutral around energy efficiency and demand management, Con Ed becomes economically animated. So let me give you a quick example. Many of you might have heard of the Brooklyn Queens initiative. That's one where Con Ed was looking at building a substation to deal with the fact that there are areas in New York City where you're seeing load growth, and they had to build a major substation. It was over $1 billion, and we challenged them and said, rather than building a substation, what can we do on the consumer side to manage demand? So you don't have that growth, and what you're doing is starting to use distributed energy resources, whether it's generation, load control, smart thermostats, et cetera, as sustainability efforts, as a mechanism to delay that infrastructure. And they were looking at sizable savings. So they came out with a request for quotes, request for interest. And we did this a little differently than we normally do in my industry, which is like your industry, is heavily engineered. Rather than having the engineers sit in a room at Con Ed and sort of figure out what they thought the solutions were, they went out and just said, here's our need, and let the vendors come in and identify the solutions. And they got a lot more innovative solutions than we could have thought of on our own. And now they're in the process of sorting them out. And what's fascinating about this is that it's different than, for example, you went to a university and a university decided to put in a CHP plant, and the facilities person and the planner were all one person, and the person paid the bill. In Con Ed, we're talking about residential, low income, NYCHA housing, commercial housing, and a myriad of different types of resources that will be essentially operated together to manage demand on a circuit. So if you think about it, it's sort of the law of the commons. When we look at the power grid, we're saying, well, let's say in the next 20 minutes, we need to reduce demand, and this building and we need 10 megawatts of reduction. Well, this building can maybe do a megawatt, another building can maybe do a half a megawatt, someone else could do it for 20 minutes, somebody else can do it for 5 minutes. What if you aggregated it all together? Because from the grid's perspective, they don't really care if it's one unit or multiple units, but if we work together through the right types of price signals in markets, what you're doing then is you're really levelizing usage, and it becomes much more economically advantageous for everyone. Because the fact is in the power grid, everyone pays the same price. So you should care as much about your neighbor reducing demand as your neighbor cares about what you're doing, because together you're actually helping each other. So that's sort of what we're doing with Brooklyn Queens, is that Con Ed will look at that almost like a microgrid, and they'll be able to look at those resources together. The other piece of REV that's changing is in addition to changing the regulatory structure, is we're also looking at other changes that we think are going to be very important to facilitate people being able to invest in distributed energy resources. One that I'm sure a lot of folks in here are aware of is standby rates. You know, a lot of people will invest in generation in their buildings, and they expect that load to be off most of the time, but there are some hours of the year they need to have backup on the grid. So how do you pay for that? Because you're using the system, but what's a fair payment scheme, and how do we make it easy for people to put in distributed generation? So we issued a ruling last year about standby generation, and we're looking again and again about how to make sure that's fair and easy for people to invest. The other aspect that we're looking at is interconnection. One of the things that we hear from a lot of developers, particularly because now we see a lot more solar development in New York, is the difficulty of working with utilities around how to interconnect their systems. And sometimes it's because the developers don't quite understand the need, and sometimes it's because the utilities don't have an easy process. So we're also looking at how to make that. There's sort of the great ideas, and then there's the very tangible things that we have to fix. The other big piece we're looking at is what we call demand response tariffs, but I really like calling them as demand management tariffs, is really sending the right price signal. So if the price of electricity, unlike any other commodity, actually can change every 5 minutes, is how to send the right price signals to customers so customers know essentially how best to manage their usage. And I don't mean that I would expect individual customers to do it, but if you work with a retailer, the retailer can essentially can help you by helping you manage it and sending the right price signals to your devices so that you're managing your resources better and optimizing those. And the other piece that's I think is going to be very important is information. So the other element of REV is making information transparent. One of the things that we hear from a lot of developers is that they're very interested in putting in resources like CHP, like fuel cells, but they'd like to know the best places in the grid. And so a part of REV that the Commission issued an order around last February is to say that we need to get rid of the information asymmetry, is that developers need to have the same information as the utilities so that you know if in fact a particular circuit, a particular part of the grid is constrained, whether it's going to be of value to Con Ed or is going to be harmful to Con Ed to put resources in, so people can plan these out. And as well as start looking at the tools to manage these resources better. So when you think about it, what we're really saying about REV is this. For the last part of the 20th century, we really worked on competition at the wholesale level. And customers had the ability to pick different suppliers. Now what we're really saying is that if we can use resources better, and part of what we're looking at is compensating people for being able to reduce demand when it's advantageous to the system, then now the competition is happening at the retail level. And for the first time, the ability to do things such as change your load shape so you're not peaking just when everyone else is peaking because you have resources that you can use, or understand the economic value of continuous commissioning because you're seeing those price signals and you're starting to see real time the value of that you're suddenly animating this third party market. The other piece that does is the ancillary benefit, but really the critical part of REV. If we manage demand better and we create a much smarter system, we're going to be able to integrate solar better, we're going to be able to integrate wind better because now we have these resources we can manage, and we can start really managing our demand to really reflect the type of energy that we want to have produced. So for example, and I will be open to questions, but I'll talk about the other things. This is like things that I love to think about. Wind energy blows the best at night. People use energy during the late afternoon hours. If we start doing things like ice storage or fuel cells and things like that, we could start shifting our energy use to the nighttime and take advantage of wind. So if you start thinking about it, the way you used to think about the grid is that we ran our generators to follow whatever the load was doing. When the load was going up, we pumped out more supply. When the load was going down, we reduced it. Now with REV, what we start doing is shaping demand so that the demand shape is really what we want to manage against the generators that we want to use. So we think about, well, when is solar available? That's when we try to shift our load. When is wind available? That's when we shift our load. Let's not all peak at the same time. Let's have this price signals so that people know if they need to shift, when they need to shift to. So it's thinking about getting a lot smarter and a lot more productive. It's almost Uberizing the electric grid. So we're looking through all that. We're looking through it in terms of markets. The other pieces we've changed is through, again, other initiatives. One is the New York Sun. As you know, the governor provided a $2 billion price incentive to build more solar. We revamped our New York Sun program, but we also developed what we call our community solar, our community renewables. And here's the idea, and this is, I think, very important for places like New York. Not everybody has a rooftop, so not everyone can put in solar on their roof. But there are areas in New York where we could put community solar, and that therefore tenants who might not own a roof have an ability to participate on that very much the same way as if they put solar on their roof. So the idea is how do you democratize it, and to make sure that you don't just only some people have the advantage of these resources, but to give them to everybody. The other aspect we're looking at is what we call community aggregation, and that's the idea of if you have various communities, whether a municipality or neighborhood, can work together and think about how you plan these resources better. We're also looking at microgrids and where they're advantageous. So the whole point of all this is to start recognizing that unlike the last century, where we thought of energy almost exclusively as large scale and customers as being passive, we're now saying that the ability to manage energy and put these resources in can be a very effective way of both addressing our resiliency concerns, our reliability concerns, our economic concerns, and our environmental concerns. And it's neither an either or, but we need to start working on the both and consumers are the both and. So that's sort of the thumbnail sketch, what we're doing. The Commission has issued a certain set of orders last year approving what we consider the new role of the utilities to integrate these resources. We're now working on the price aspects. The other piece we're doing is a lot of work around demonstration. So we're now that rather than going to scale, is going from step by step so we learn while we're doing. And thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions if we have time. Are we good?